Welcome back, everyone, to part 2 of our look at the history of Russia. We're going to be picking up today in the 17th century with the beginning of the Romanov dynasty. If you didn't see part 1 from yesterday, there's a link in the description that will take you back to that, as well as a link to Epic History TV's part 2, which is what we'll be looking at today as our basis for our discussion. If you are interested at all in looks at the actual battlefields of history and historic sites, I have a lot of original content here on the channel looking at battlefields. Normally Sundays and Wednesdays have been when I've been uploading my latest from my visit to France, to the World War I battlefields of France. I'm waiting until tomorrow for the next episode. My friend JD over at the History Underground, who I think has the best historic site content on YouTube anywhere, usually has videos that come out on Sundays and Wednesdays. So I don't want to step on what he's doing and has been doing for a while. So I'm moving my uploads for those to Mondays and Thursdays, just so folks have a chance to see both and hopefully do so. So I'm going to be uploading my next episode tomorrow. And then after that, what I'm going to do is a lot of people have requested that I put together all 5 episodes from my visit to the Somme battlefield into one big video. So I'm going to be doing that, and that'll come out later this week. And now we're going to be moving on to some other battlefields. I've got stuff from some of the American battlefields we're going to look at next, as well as some other places like Champagne, Verdun, and a whole lot more. So excited to be continuing to share that with you. What I need you to do is I need you to click on those videos when they go live. Traditionally, my historic site videos get the lowest click rate, which means that fewer of our subscribers watch those videos than anything else I do. And I've had a lot of people tell me, oh man, I've never watched your original content, your site videos before, but they're great. So hopefully you'll find that out as well. So when you see those come up on the feed, please click on them. It would help a lot, because how many subscribers watch the videos and click on it determines how often YouTube recommends it to people who aren't subscribers. So the more of you who click on those things, the more other people will get to see them too. So you'll be helping the channel grow. You'll be helping get the word out to more people about history. So thank you in advance. Here we go, part 2 of the history of Russia.
In 1612, Russia was in a state of anarchy. They called it the Time of Troubles. The people were terrorized by war, famine, and plague. Up to 1/3 of them perished. Foreign troops occupied Moscow, Smolensk, and Novgorod. But then, Russia fought back. Prince Pozharsky and a merchant, Kuzma Minin, led the Russian militia to Moscow and threw out the Polish garrison. Since 2005, this event has been commemorated every 4th of November as Russian National Unity Day.
Well, there's a face we didn't think we'd be seeing today, huh? We've been seeing him a lot on the news lately. And I am going to be uploading another video probably tomorrow, just sharing my thoughts about the ongoing conflict in Ukraine, and just some more observations and parallels to history that I've seen. So hopefully you'll watch that as well. Yeah, it's interesting. You know, for most of recent history, well, I shouldn't say most. For a good bit of Russia's recent history, Moscow was not the capital. It was St. Petersburg, which later became Leningrad. That was built up on the northern coast. But Moscow has always been kind of the cultural and kind of heart of Russia, even today, now being the capital again.
The Russian Assembly, the Zemsky Sabor, realized the country had to unite behind a new ruler and elected a 16-year-old noble, Mikhail Romanov, as the next Tsar. His dynasty would rule Russia for the next 300 years. Tsar Mikhail exchanged territory for peace, winning Russia much-needed breathing space. His son, Tsar Alexei, implemented a new legal code, the Sabornoye Ulozhenie.
And what's cool about this is seeing a name like Alexei, and I don't know how common some of these names are in Russia, even today, but had Tsar Nicholas II, who was the last Tsar of Russia, of the Romanov dynasty, had he lived and been able to continue on his throne, his son, Alexei, who was a lot of the center of controversy, was hemophiliac, would have succeeded him to the throne. So that's a name that goes back to the very beginnings of the Romanov dynasty.
It turned all Russian peasants, 80% of the population, into serfs, effectively slaves.
Yeah.
Their status inherited by their children, and with no freedom to travel or choose their master.
Serfs were kind of bound to the land. And so if a master sold his land to someone else, the serfs who lived on that land would go with them. And so it really was slavery in all but name. And that serfdom lasts long after most other countries abolished slavery, except for the United States. I think the United States is kind of late to that game.
It was a system that dominated Russian rural life for the next 200 years. The head of the Russian Orthodox Church, Patriarch Nikon, imposed religious reforms that split the church between reformers and old believers.
And to say a little something else about the whole idea of serfdom, for most of at least the European world at this time, a lot of it's in the feudal system, in which you have people who work the land, you have lords who own that land, and then those lords have lords over them, and it's kind of that feudal, it's almost like a pyramid system, where a lord has a lord has a lord, and it kind of trickles down, and a guy calls up his troops, for example, his levies, and they all have to fight for their lord. So that's, rather than being a nation, you really have that feudal system where you have people bound to different people. And it's weird at times because, for example, you have the King of England at one time, who is a vassal in the feudal system to the King of France, not for his lands in England, but because of lands he owns in France. So he is a lord over the people in England, but he's subservient to the French king for lands that he owns in France. It's a very strange system to us today. But to take 80% of your population and just virtually enslave them is an incredible thing to pull off and get away with, and just shows you the power that the Romanovs had in this autocratic system over their people.
It's a schism that continues to this day. Ukrainian Cossacks, rebelling against the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, recognized Tsar Alexei as overlord in exchange for his military support.
So there you have Ukrainian Cossacks recognizing Alexei as overlord in 1654. So here's some of that history coming in. Crimean Khanate is still ruled by descendants of Genghis Khan and his kingdom, his empire, but that'll of course change as well.
It led to the 13 Years' War between Russia and the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Russia emerged victorious, reclaiming Smolensk and taking control of eastern Ukraine.
And at that time, I believe Ukraine actually is a word for borderland, which is why often it gets called the Ukraine, because it's basically the borderland. And it was that border, that area. I don't know how far back the name goes, but it's that borderland before these two powerful empires, these two powerful kingdoms, the Poland-Lithuanian Commonwealth and Russia.
A revolt against Tsarist government, led by a renegade Cossack, Stenka Razin, brought anarchy to southern Russia. It was finally suppressed. Razin was brought to Moscow and executed by quartering.
Ooh.
The sickly but highly educated Fyodor III passed many reforms.
Only 6 years on
the
the throne.
He abolished Mesnichestva, the system that had awarded government posts according to nobility rather than merit, and symbolically burned the ancient books of rank.
That's incredible. 1682. This is a full 100 years before the American Revolution, which a lot of that was about rank and merit versus nobility and things like that. There's a lot of that going on, and the Americans write into the Constitution that there can't be ranks of nobility granted to American citizens. And so this is a full 100 years before that they're recognizing merit versus nobility. That's incredible.
But Fyodor died aged just 19. His sister Sophia became Princess Regent, ruling on behalf of her younger brothers, the joint Tsars Ivan V and Peter I. After centuries of conflict, Russia and the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth signed a Treaty of Eternal Peace.
Did you ever notice how treaties of eternal or perpetual peace never live up to that name? There was one signed by Henry VIII and King Francis of France that was at the Field of the Cloth of Gold. In the early 1500s, it was supposed to be a treaty of perpetual peace between England and France. And that didn't even outlast those two kings, let alone the nations.
Then joined the Holy League in its war against the Ottoman Empire. Sophia's reign also saw the first treaty between Russia and China, establishing the frontier between the two states.
This is what's amazing about Russia being as large as it is. Look at the history going on here. You've got them in the West dealing with the European powers, and they're going to be getting involved in things like the Napoleonic Wars, and they're fighting the Ottomans, and they become kind of one of the traditional allies, or one of the traditional opponents of the Ottoman Empire, and they claim to be defending Christianity and things like that. And that'll go on for the next 200 plus years, their wars with the Ottomans. And then all the way in the East, they're dealing with China and Japan and even the United States through the East eventually with things like selling Alaska to the United States in the 1800s. Just incredible the size of Russia that gives it so many connections to so much of the world. Peter the Great. There's a big change coming for Russia here.
At age 17, Peter I seized power from his half-sister Sophia. Peter became the first Russian ruler to travel abroad. He toured Europe with his grand embassy.
And this will define him. This is such a great thing because this is why it's important, and this is kind of a life lesson in general, right? Get out of your echo chamber. Get out of what you always know. Stop only listening to people who look like you, think like you, talk like you. Get to know people in other places. My trip to France a couple of weeks ago was such an eye-opening experience because it gave me an opportunity to see how people do things differently. There were like little things, like cultural things. But there are also things like the fact that when I went to McDonald's, they didn't give me a lid on my drink or a straw, just because they do things differently. And the portion sizes were smaller. And there was a pizza vending machine there that I'd never seen before. A lot of things, about how they do, how they sell food and gas and all those sorts of things that are just done differently. The pop that I drank had less sugar in it. And I noticed there were a lot less fat people there. So just little things like that made me realize, wow, there's different ways to do things. And that happens for Peter here. He sees how the West is growing. He starts to see, he sees the beginnings of what will become the Industrial Revolution. And he's like, we need to take this stuff back to Russia.
Seeking allies for Russia's war against Turkey, and learning the latest developments in science and shipbuilding. The war against Turkey was successfully concluded by the Treaty of Constantinople. Russia gained Azov from Turkey's ally, the Crimean Khanate, and with it, a foothold on the Black Sea.
But here's a problem, and this continues to be a problem to this day. Who controls the only way you can get from the Black Sea out to the Mediterranean? Well, the Ottomans do. And that's actually an issue to this day because Turkey, who is the successor to the Ottoman Empire and controls this territory, is in NATO. And so there's a real issue there with allowing ships to pass and treaty obligations that they have in terms of those things. And I think right now the issue is that there's something in place with the treaty that even ships that they would otherwise block are allowed to pass through the Dardanelles if they're going back to their home port. So it's all very, very complicated.
Peter made many reforms, seeking to turn Russia into a modern European state. He demanded Russian nobles dress and behave like Europeans. He made those who refused to shave pay a beard tax.
A beard tax. Well, I can say one thing for sure. I will never have to worry about paying that tax. I can't grow a beard. I've always had that trouble. But imagine how this must have been received in Russia. Put yourself in their place for a second. Your Tsar, your emperor, goes over, and I don't think he's called an emperor yet. I think he's still called Tsar. But he goes over to the West, and he comes back, and he starts telling everybody that you have to act like the West. You have to dress like them. You have to do your facial hair like them. And I bet a lot of people would have rejected that and said, no, this is the way we've done things. This is the Russian way. We're not going to become like the French and the British. But he had a lot of authority and a lot of influence and really pushed this on the Russians.
Peter built the first Russian navy, reformed the army and government, and promoted industry, trade, and education.
A lesson that probably would have been best learned by future czars and not. Catherine the Great does a good job with this stuff too, but by the time you get to Nicholas II, the end of the Romanov dynasty, Russia's fallen behind quite a bit in things like industry, and they only just start to get that back at the beginning of the 20th century.
In the Great Northern War, Russia, Poland, Lithuania, and Denmark took on the dominant power in the Baltic, Sweden.
And this is what I alluded to this yesterday, and I got a little bit ahead of myself in talking about Sweden as a power at the end of the 1500s, beginning of the 1600s. This is where Sweden's at the height of its power. This is when you have Charles XII on the throne of Sweden, and he decides to kind of go full Napoleon, and he's going to start dominating. He's going to go to war with Russia, Poland, Lithuania, even Denmark, and it's their combined power that for a while is barely able to hang on, and Charles XII actually has a lot of early success, but much like Napoleon, eventually the combined might of all these European powers is going to become too much.
The war began badly for Russia with a disastrous defeat to Charles XII of Sweden at Narva. But Russia won a second Battle of Narva, before crushing Charles XII's army at the Battle of Poltava. On the Baltic coast, Peter completed construction of a new capital,
there it is,
St. Petersburg. The building of what would become Russia's second largest city among coastal marshes was a remarkable achievement.
It was, and it happened during a time of war. They build this new capital city. They build it right on Swedish territory. This is a gutsy thing to do because Moscow's inland. It's back away from the front lines. He builds this on territory I think that they had just taken from Sweden. They're still at war at this time. It's gutsy, and it pays off. And of course, like I said earlier, this is going to become Leningrad, and now it's back to St. Petersburg for a while. It's called Petrograd. Depending on who was in charge in Russia or the Soviet Union, they've gone through a lot of different names. Stalingrad is now Volgograd, I think, which I think grad is just a name for city in Russian.
Though it cost the lives of many thousands of serfs. The Great Northern War ended with the Treaty of Nystad. Russia's gains at Sweden's expense made it the new dominant Baltic power. 4 years before his death, Peter was declared Peter the Great, father of his country, emperor of all the Russias.
And there's where you have the term emperor. So up until that point, it's just been Tsar. And we still use the term Tsar to refer to the people after that, like Tsar Nicholas II. But technically, his title was emperor.
Peter was succeeded by his wife Catherine, then his grandson Peter II, who died of smallpox, aged just 14. Empress Anna Ivanovna, daughter of Peter the Great's half-brother Ivan V, was famed for her decadence and the influence of her German lover, Ernst Biron.
And this is where we're going to start to see German and Prussian influence. Prussian is just a part of Germany, but Prussian influence into Russia. And it's interesting how much of not only the Russian royal family, but the British royal family are really German.
During Anna's reign, Vitus Bering, a Danish explorer in Russian service, led the first expedition to chart the coast of Alaska.
This is where you get the name for the Bering Strait and the Bering Sea. It's from this guy.
Discovered the Aleutian Islands, and later gave his name to the sea that separates Russia
Take a
and
shot,
America.
I just said it.
After Anna's death, her infant grandnephew Ivan VI was deposed by Peter the Great's daughter Elizabeth.
So you can kind of see how things are not real stable at this time. And this happens when you have either weak or young people coming to the throne. Because Peter the Great didn't leave things in the hands of a son who was adult and strong, it's kind of bouncing back and forth between him and his brother's lines, and it's going to take a while before you get another strong ruler.
Ivan VI spent his entire life in captivity. Until age 23, he was murdered by his guards during a failed rescue attempt. Elizabeth, meanwhile, was famed for her vanity, extravagance, and many young lovers. But she was also capable of decisive leadership. In alliance with France and Austria, Elizabeth led Russia into the 7 Years' War against Frederick the Great of Prussia.
And look, if you just look at the territory itself, Prussia is a pretty minor player compared to Russia and Austria and the Ottoman Empire and France and Britain. But think about how much of the next 200 years is going to be dominated by Germans. And it begins with Prussia.
The Russian army inflicted a crushing defeat on Frederick at the Battle of Kunersdorf, but failed to exploit its victory. Meanwhile, in St. Petersburg, the Winter Palace was completed at vast expense.
Beautiful palace.
It would remain the monarch's official residence right up until the Russian Revolution of 1917. Peter III was Peter the Great's grandson by his elder daughter Anna Petrovna, who died as a consequence of childbirth. Raised in Denmark, Peter spoke hardly any Russian, and greatly admired Russia's enemy, Frederick the Great. So he had Russia swap sides in the 7 Years' War, saving Frederick from almost certain defeat. Peter's actions angered many army officers, and he'd always been despised by his German wife, Catherine. Together, they deposed Peter III,
Here she comes.
who died a week later in suspicious circumstances.
And, you know, we talk about this all the time. It's a product of the times. When you have someone get deposed, more often than not, they end up dead. Because a lot of times what happens is the person who deposes them, you know, really doesn't want that person to die. They don't want to kill him because a lot of times they're deposing a family member, a husband, a cousin, a sibling, and they don't want that person to die. But what ends up happening is as soon as you depose that person and you take power, the people who have lost influence or lost power and want to get it back will use that person you deposed as the figurehead of their revolution. All right, if we can just overthrow Catherine, we can put Peter III back on the throne, because then it's not treason, because we're just trying to support who we see as the rightful ruler. And so then if you're Catherine, what do? You can't have this person continue to be the object of revolution and civil war, so you have to get rid of them. It happens over and over and over again in history. Just one example, Mary, we know as Bloody Mary in England. She overthrows a brief 2-week reign by her cousin, Lady Jane Grey. Initially, Jane is thrown in to the Tower of London, but she's not otherwise harmed. But then revolutions start. And so she's like, we can't do this. And I think like 6 months or a year after Jane was thrown in prison, 17 years old, they have her executed because they just have to bring stability back to the realm. That's what happens.
His wife, Catherine, became Empress of Russia.
And she's
Her
Prussian.
reign would be remembered as one of Russia's most glorious.
It's amazing that one of Russia's greatest rulers is born Prussian. She was actually born in what today is Poland, but at the time was part of Prussia, and she's German in terms of her background. But she embraces Russian Orthodox Christianity. She embraces the Russian culture, the language, the people, the history. She really does become Russian. All right, well, that is another episode in the books. We'll be back soon with another one, but please check out my original content. Watch for that next episode coming out tomorrow. Please click on it and watch it. Even if you're not interested, just let it play in the background. It'll help the channel a whole lot. And if you want to support in a more meaningful way, please consider joining as one of our patrons. The link is in the description below. And check out some of my other content here. Thanks for watching.